There's another line, I don't know if it's again the play or the book, but again more so the way you captured it, and it was from David's producer, I believe, and he said David doesn't do failure.
Right.
Yet we know for a fact that Nixon not only does failure, but he does failure over and over and over again. And I couldn't help but think, though, when you really do look at great figures, and I don't even want to take sides if they're great morally or whatnot, but just great figures, whether it's from Churchill to Moses, and I'm not saying Nixon's one of these people, they've all had tremendous failures and then rebirths, failures and rebirths. There's something about that in the human spirit that you bring out in this particular version of Frost Nixon that I found grabbed me at a level very deep.
Well, that's great. Look, again, two really dogged, kind of indomitable figures. And both actors, Michael Sheen and Frank Langella, had so much to offer in terms of what they'd learned about these characters. David Frost is incredibly competitive. And the remarkable thing about him is that he doesn't really acknowledge losing. He really doesn't. That idea of doesn't know how to fail. Of course he's failed. Right after this Nixon interview, where he was riding high, he had a debacle of an interview with Henry Kissinger, where Kissinger basically walked out. And it was supposed to be a similar sort of a lengthy special, and it turned into like he managed to get one interview out of it. But he had failed relationships and humiliations, but he just sort of would never acknowledge them. I think Nixon would acknowledge them and use them as fuel. I think Frost's idea was to pretend they never happened and just carry on. Two very different ways of sort of arriving at the same goal, just a mindset of constantly moving forward.
You give a quote by Dad and you can see why it's tough, but for him it was natural, because here's what he says: without love, which really is respect for your fellow man, there can be no faith in ourselves or in others. Without faith, there can be no hope. Without hope, there's no future. So for him, he saw the connection very clearly, and obviously he did pass that on to you as you grew further and further.
You got the book. You got it. Yeah, those are the connections. That's absolutely right. I think what I wrote was hoping somebody would understand the book as well as you've got it. Yeah, he made those connections, and he understood the importance of faith, and that faith demanded hope and acts of love, and that's really what sustains you. That you can be great when these lights are on you, and be a big shot and have a corner office or a lot of money, or be on the front page of the paper. But really what's important, what has power, as the last line of the book is, without blowing the book, is he believed that faith, hope, and love. He believed in faith, hope, and love. He believes that they have power. And that's what the book is about. It's about a guy who was great on a national and international scale, but more importantly, understood those concepts and lived his life according to those ideas. You clearly got it. That's an honor.
Well, I'm honored you said that, but you wrote it in a manner that, and I'll go back to the original thing I said, is you allow us to see you discover it. And as you discover it, we can't help but discover it ourselves. That's what makes it a touching thing to read. You're not reading a biography about your dad.
No.
You're not at all. It's not that. Although you will get, as I said, some interesting insights into history, but you are literally learning what it is required to possess goodness.
Right, you got it. I mean, there's not much I can say. You nailed it. I mean, the opening scene of the book is driving over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and it's a journey. We're in a car, and that was the reason for it, is that the book is a journey. And I look over, we're late, and I look over at the sun rising, and I know we're half an hour late, and I'm irritated. And he looks at it and says, "Oh my God, I can't wait to die. I want to meet the guy, the creator who made that." And to figure out why a guy at 64 at the top of his game at that point, and I'm 25 or something like that, has that much joy about being on earth, but still wants to be in heaven at some point. And figuring all that out and understanding why a man with that much energy had his life built around faith, hope, and love, and how to incorporate that is a journey. And it's a journey every day, as a matter of fact. You know, I'm struggling with this every day. How do I balance my marriage of 20 years to my beautiful wife, raising 3 kids, aging in-laws, family, friends, work? That's what the book is about, because here's a guy who did do it and did it really well.
Well, one of the things important to you was you brought out that AJ and Erin, a certain amount of uncertainty. Certainty is something that too many people rely on and don't allow for the uncertainty to brew up within, because oftentimes I feel it is through the uncertainty, the questioning, that discovery of the uncertain, that we really find out what we're about, what our nation's about, what the universe is about.
And a lot of us don't like to question things because I think we feel that people can put us in a box, but most importantly, we put ourselves into a box. I mean, I grew up in a situation, and AJ has experienced the same, and even watching what's going on with her son and his disabilities, sometimes we put ourselves in that box. And I grew up always, because see, everybody else, because I had a learning disability, thought that I was a loser. It didn't take me till later in life. It took me till later in life to realize that was their choice to see me that way, but it didn't have to be my choice. And many times, other people's perception of who we are, we really take literally, and then we start to believe that, and we don't question things because we think, well, I'm not a doctor or a scientist or a lawyer, I don't have my PhD, or we're afraid somebody's gonna laugh at us, and we won't ask sometimes the most guttural, common sense questions because we know something's wrong, we know something isn't right, but for that reason, we will keep ourselves in that box. And I think it's really important to begin as an individual and collectively as a neighborhood, state by state, throughout the whole country, to go home again, each one of us, and get back into believing in ourselves.
Mitch, you know, the one thing that listening to you talk about Henry, I gather from what I read here, and I'll use your words, what you learned from him, the rabbi, and then yourself. It was about the actions that these people took. It wasn't just the messages that they gave. And you realize throughout this that we are all frail parts of something powerful. That's, I think, we'll call it the epiphany that came to you. It was you, like you said, God and you didn't bother each other, you were fine. It was the essence that we're part of something more powerful than ourselves that seems to really encapsulate your own search.
Yeah, I think I probably had that hit home to me the most towards the end of the rabbi's life. We were having a discussion about heaven, and I was asking so many questions that he did one of his little turn to gods, and he said, you know, please, Lord, he has so many questions. Give him many more years on earth so when we see each other again, we'll have lots to talk about, you know. And I looked at him, and I said, you really think we're going to see each other again? And he said, well, don't you? And I said, well, let's face it, I don't think I'm going where you're going. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, you're on a whole different level. You're a man of God. And he looked at me very sweetly, and he said, but you're a man of God too. Everyone is. And you could have knocked me over with a brick, because for this 90-year-old man of righteous, pious stature to put himself voluntarily on the same level as me, who was nowhere near that, not only showed that the right spirit of what faith is, that it's not about how many points you score. It's not that you've got 100 and someone else has 50, you're more righteous or whatever. It's at recognizing that we are all children of God, whether within one faith or just simply on the planet. And if everybody was able to turn to everybody else and say, you're a man of God too, everyone is, then we would certainly treat each other better than we do. And we would recognize that faith is not something that should be dividing us, but something that should be uniting us, no matter what it is, because this concept of believing in something bigger than us is very universal and can be used for, you know, the good, to pull together.
You have an episode called The Color Blue.
Right.
And I can't help but think that there's something in that episode that, again, seems to transcend slightly through all of them. And what happens here is the teacher of one of Don's children, Don is having a relationship with. And she, in a dark scene, two of them in bed,
Yeah.
she tells him the story of a young boy who comes up to her and asks her, how come we all, I'm paraphrasing it now, we all see the same thing when we see blue? Why does when I see blue look like blue? Why does when you see it look like blue?
This 8-year-old, Charlie, looked up at me during art today and said, how do I know if what I see as blue is the same as it is to you?
What did you say?
The truth. I don't know. I never have. But I love that he made me think about that again.
That's the thing is we want to belong. We want to see it the same way. We don't. We're terrified by talk about isolation.
You know, that's an interesting concept that prevails through this thing, because these characters, the times, everything is different, yet we're all related.
I agree, and that to me. It's so funny that you mentioned that scene, because that scene to me is in quintessence how the show works.
In fact, the hardest thing for you to do was to forgive yourself for feeling that way, wasn't it? Isn't
Yes.
that's the hardest thing for all, talk
Yes.
about the universal feeling. The hardest thing for us to do is when we feel we've done wrong, we keep punishing ourselves for the wrong, even though there really was no quote unquote wrong done. It was just the way it was. And
we loved each other. That was the great muck-up. We loved each other so deeply. He wanted to make it work. We had a baby, we had a beautiful child. But you know, what I've learned in simple terms is you really can't make somebody else happy. You have to bring that. And I expected him to make me happy. He expected me to make him happy. Didn't work. It doesn't work that way. You bring that to the relationship, and then it cooks. Then it, is such an alive, living thing.
you know, when you came into the green room even, you said that's still what you're searching for to this.
Well, I so admire what you have with your wife, that beautiful woman, and you've been very generous in sharing the story with me, and I think it's what so many people are looking for. And it seems today that, I mean, 1 out of 1 marriage ends in divorce. 1 out of 2, it's crippling. So to see that it actually works, yes, I would love to have that kind of relationship with someone. And I'll tell you something I don't think I've ever even said before. I don't think I was ready for it until now. Because I think before you really can really be totally unselfish and you can love unconditionally, you're not ready to have a relationship.
You know, isn't it funny? I can't say on air what we talked about before, but you shared something to me about being ready. And I get that same sense. I don't know, this clarified it more than even that other part of the conversation. You're right. You have to be ready within yourself, and then you draw it to you.
Yes. I just don't know why it's taken so blinking long.
That's what I've been saying to my wife, the same thing. It's the exact same thing. I have no clue why it's taking so long. In fact, last week I wrote an essay on time for my newsletter. And the thing I still have, the hardest problem is it feels like I'm running out of it. And yet I know intellectually time is just what it is. And when the time is right, that's when it is going to happen.
Together. It just all comes together. You don't have to, in a relationship, you shouldn't have to, like your precious wife was saying to me, you know, people say to her, you have to work to make it happen, but she says it just happens. And I believe that it just fits. It doesn't, you don't have to keep trying to make it happen.
One of the things that caught my mind was this analogy you used about a radio. And you said a radio is sitting there and it is picking up music from, and we, by the way, you made it interestingly clear that we know somewhat the science of how the waves may travel, but the consciousness is different because, as you said, we may, and this goes back to that old saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there, does it make a sound? The answer, I'm going to have to take a leap here, according to you, would be no, because it'll make a sound wave, but no one would hear it, nothing would hear it. The sound is not in your brain. It's only this translation of chemicals that come around from the wave, yet we can make these deductions. So in that way, the universe exists because we think it exists.
What you just said is beautiful. I mean, I'm not just saying it because it's beautiful. The fact is, the sound waves exist, but the universe is silent. There's no sound in the universe. The sound is all in here. That is exactly. The sound waves exist, but the machine that picks them up, I'm just being very material in this statement, the brain that picks them up, do we know exactly how the waves make the eardrum move and the bones move and the other eardrum and the hairs in our auditory canal? That's all chemistry, but that's not sound. The sound is totally how we perceive it. We know how all the information comes in. That's why I just really, sometimes I get goosebumps when I think about these, what you just said. The tree falls, there's no sound, you're exactly right. The sound waves are there. But until you hear it, until the system that picks up those sound waves through the ears, whether it's an animal or whether it's a human, then it becomes sound. In your brain, the way I would say it, in your brain there's no sound. I hear you talking, you hear me talking, but there's no sound in your brain. There's chemistry in your brain. So the simplistic answer is, well, we interpret that chemistry as sound. Obviously we do. That's why we think we're hearing sound. But where's the interpretation? It's the replay that becomes a problem. The information coming in we know, but where's the replay? Any neurologist will tell you, put a microstethoscope anywhere in the brain, you don't hear any sound. You might hear gurgle, gurgle as the blood goes through the veins, but there's no sound, no A, B, C, D, nothing. So where's the sound? I think that we get the sound in the mind and not in the brain. And that the mind, it's a debate that's been going on, but there's so much neurology that's known, and there's no explanation for many phenomena, like the universe being silent, but we don't hear it as silent, we hear it as sound.
You phrase it talking about the complexities, and yet it's funny how you saw these complexities through the simplicity of this wonder. I think that juxtaposition truly feeds the human spirit when you're aware to see the complexities and get away from simplifying it on one level and yet appreciating it on that simple level. It's a little hard to understand, but your book takes us through that.
It's sort of an example of what you're talking about. As I say, let's say you lived in a neighborhood for 20 years and you've walked that neighborhood hundreds of times and you know every block, and you stop seeing things that are wonderful about it. You've simplified it, just what you've said. You've taken the complex and you've made it simple by familiarity. And it's in the complexity of it that the beauty of it arises. And when you're able suddenly to see, because the dog will stop and be fascinated with a particular set of tree shadows, when you see what the dog's fascinated with and you start looking and you think, look at the amazing patterns of these shadows. And you start looking at the beauty of things that seemed simple to you or even mundane before, and suddenly they're not mundane anymore, and they're beautiful, and you begin to recognize the world as a place of wonder that is a magnificent gift to us, and we should always remain aware of how the simplest things are intricately beautiful.
I want to talk about your biggest lesson that you mention in the book.
Oh, remind me what it is.
It's what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Learning how to forgive myself for being human. That one there. Love myself enough to just let it go. And this is the part I like how you add on to it. Have I forgotten what I know since then? Yes. Have I been able to remember? Yes. I think that's the message I want to make sure people leave, that no matter how much wisdom they get, they're going to fall back into these things. Catch themselves. Will they fall back in again? Yes, but catch yourself. And that's that lesson. And then forgive yourself. If you could only do that. And that, by the way, that's it in my opinion.
Yeah, forgive yourself. If you can forgive yourself, you can forgive everyone. And if you forgive, you're free.
Dee, our time is up. So all I can say is thank you so much for sharing that energy with us today. I just know a lot of people are going to be able to, at least when they're done with this, take that deep breath and just know, hey, if Dee can keep doing it, so can I. Thank you, Dee, so much.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for joining us. Now before Dee leaves, I'd like to leave you with these last few words from Bright Light. Acting like life was a spiritual process, and like nature, we must constantly rebalance ourselves, going from the torrential rains that wash away the old to the droughts that dry us up, and back to the quintessential climate for our growth. I'm Barry Kibrick. Between the torrential rains and the droughts we experience lies our quintessential self. Embrace it and grow. And thank you, Dee Wallace.
Oh, thank you, Barry.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Turned into like a, you know, he managed to get one interview out of it. But he had failed relationships and humiliations, but he just sort of would never acknowledge them. I think Nixon would acknowledge them and use them as fuel. I think Frost's idea was to pretend they never happened and just carry on. Two very different ways of sort of arriving.
In this particular version of Frost-Nixon that I found grabbed me at a level very deep.
Well, that's great. Look, again, two really dogged, kind of indomitable figures. And both actors, Michael Sheen and Frank Langella, had so much to offer in terms of what they'd learned about these characters. David Frost is incredibly competitive.
There's another line, I don't know if it's again the play or the book, but again more so the way you captured it, and it was from David's producer, I believe, and he said David doesn't do failure.
Right.
Yet we know for a fact that Nixon not only does failure, but he does failure over and over and over again. And I couldn't help but think, though, when you really do look at great figures, and I don't even want to take sides if they're great morally or whatnot, but just great figures, whether it's from Churchill to Moses, and I'm not saying Nixon's one of these people, they've all had tremendous failures and then rebirths, failures and rebirths. There's something about that in the human spirit that you bring out.
And the remarkable thing about him is that he doesn't really acknowledge losing. He really doesn't. That idea of doesn't know how to fail. Of course he's failed. Right after this Nixon interview, where he was riding high, he had a debacle of an interview with Henry Kissinger, where Kissinger basically walked out. And it was supposed to be a similar sort of a lengthy special, and it